The 2022-2023 budget was presented in the House of Assembly just yesterday. The nation watched with much a bated breath, some citizens expecting increase in taxes, while others paid attention to areas they felt would affect them directly. At the conclusion of the presentation, many faces held smiles, while others appeared to be shocked. The one conclusion they came to is that budget presentation can certainly be termed a crowd pleaser. Prime Minister Honorable Philip Brave Davis held the stage in the House of Assembly for a little under 2 hours, doling out budgetary promises of concessions, pay increases, cost of living support, more social service assistance, agricultural relief, and the whole 9 yards. It seems like no one was left out of this budget that appears to have no downside at all. It all seems very good and promising, a crowd pleaser to say the least, but is it really attainable? Our guests from RF Bank and Trust Limited are waiting in the wings to discuss tonight's topic, Budget 2022, a plan for recovery and progress. I'm Candino Knowles filling in for Jerome Sawyer. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
The project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
at the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Welcome back. As said, Budget 2022-2023 was presented in Parliament yesterday. Many are still in awe of the niceties in that budget. Here with me from RF Bank and Trust Limited to discuss Budget 2022, a plan for recovery and progress, are David Slatter, VP of Investments, and Jim Wilson, VP of Corporate Finance. Gentlemen, welcome to On the Record. Good to have you with us.
Hi, Candino. Thank you for having us. Great to be here.
Sure.
Yeah, Candino, thank you.
Yeah. So before we get into it all, your general thoughts on this budget. We'll start with you, Jim.
I think in one word, I think it's an optimistic budget. I think it's reliant heavily on the economy continuing to grow and hasn't made any real allowance for any kind of missteps in the world economy, a U.S. recession, hurricanes in our own backyard. And of course, it also presupposes that we really are at the end of COVID.
So. David?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a reliance on the GDP growth of the country. And as we know, our economy's GDP is not totally, but predominantly dependent on the U.S. economy, tourists coming from the U.S. So as Jim mentioned, if there's a hiccup in the global economic outlook as far as the rate of growth in the U.S. economy, that could negatively impact the rate of growth of the Bahamian economy, and that could prove to be, what should I say, somewhat stressful for the budget as it is prepared.
Well, the Prime Minister said that this budget puts the government firmly on course to rescue the economy. He's also saying that one of the government's top priorities is to help Bahamians cope with cost of living hikes, right? We've seen a rise in inflation in recent times. So many other global factors that are impacting that, to your point about what's happening in the world economy, David. But he wants to lower the cost of customs duties for certain food items and also increase enforcement of price control. What is your take on this? Do you think that this is feasible and will it happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that inflation is a major concern for our economy, the global economy. And based on what I've read and seen as far as research, inflation may be with us It's not a short-term thing, not a medium-term issue. It could be with us for the long term. And when I say inflation, I'm not talking about 7 and 8%. I'm talking about maybe 3 to 4%. Whereas, say, the U.S. central bank and most central banks are targeting 2%. So 3 to 4% is above the long-term target of many central banks. And it makes sense that with inflationary pressures, the impact on everybody as far as meeting your basic needs, to include some elements in the budget to help alleviate these price pressures, it's understandable. But now, you have to bear in mind that when you reduce duties, you reduce revenue to some extent. The counter argument could be that maybe with lower prices, more is consumed, and therefore there's more revenue generated. But, you know, as Jim mentioned earlier, it's finely tuned, and things have to really follow the script. And if the rest of the world decides to not follow the script, then of course we'll have to adapt.
It almost leaves no room for error, right?
No, there's no room for error in this budget. You know, the Bahamas, we've come through a really rough 2.5 years, starting with Dorian, followed by COVID. So the government really is in a tough spot. I mean, thankfully, very thankfully, tourism is coming back, which remains our biggest part of the economy. We've seen some very positive steps with respect to foreign direct investment. We've got these crypto exchanges moving here. We've got some great announcements coming out of Freeport.
Right,
Grand
you got the Grand
Bahama.
Lucayan deal that was just recently announced, and the Carnival Cruises breaking ground on its cruise port, right?
Yeah, and also the shipyard is supposed to be getting underway with their the 2 new dry docks that they're supposed to be putting in. Now, longer-term projects, but all very positive for the country. The question is, and I think, as I mentioned before, an optimistic budget is getting through 2022 and into 2023 without any external shocks. And as David is pointing out, you know, we really are reliant on what happens in the rest of the world economy. So not an envious place for the government to be right now in setting a budget.
And is that realistic to think that way, though, or to plan that way, I should say, in terms of, you know, not even leaving some room for error, perhaps the fact that we could have another natural disaster, right? We saw that with Dorian, for instance, right? And the government of the day at that time, perhaps not planning for a catastrophe of that magnitude, right? We see something like that again. Where does this budget put us?
Well, you know, negative externalities, exogenous factors like Dorian, like COVID, they happen, all right? Our main risk is that the last thing we need is something like that to happen in the short term. Does another variant of COVID lead to travel restrictions and therefore reduced numbers as far as U.S. tourists? Do we have a severe hurricane season? The fiscal state of the government is such that we're getting to the point, our ability to deal with such a shock is being lessened. So with Dorian and with COVID, we were able to go to the international markets, we were able to borrow foreign reserves to boost our foreign reserve position and to fund the deficit spending that was needed during that trying period. My concern is that to what extent can we turn to the debt markets, domestically and externally, to fund fiscal deficits if we have another shock like that. And in this case, even though you see an improvement in the recurrent deficit, that's solely based on primarily VAT revenue growing, which is dependent on consumption, which is dependent on economic growth.
I want to touch on something you said earlier about the inflation rate, 3 to 4%,
right?
Possibly what we're looking at, right? What does that mean for the average Joe? How does that impact the average man on the street who is hearing that number but may not necessarily know how that actually impacts them or what that looks like?
Well, I mean, if one looks at one's budget and you don't have much fat to trim, in other words, basically what you're bringing in, you're consuming, if the cost of consumption goes up and what you're earning isn't going up proportionally, then you've got to make tough decisions. You've got to cut back on certain things. So discretionary spending has to be reduced, more carpooling, more. I mean, if one has 2 cars, if you have to change maybe your diet when you go to the food store, the things that you consume, That could lead to a less healthy diet. And it goes on and on. The cost of medical treatment, the cost of education. There's the knock-on effect. And of course, a key driver of inflation right now is the price of oil, but also supply chain bottlenecks. We think that over time, the supply chain bottlenecks will get reduced, but they're going to be around for a while. You have a war in Ukraine. You have the risk of that war expanding beyond Ukraine, the West getting directly involved. There's all of these risks that are totally out of our control. What is under our control is, to a great extent, the budget and the assumptions that are made. And I know there's no new taxes, no increase in tax rates, but to say that that's not on the table and to perhaps not allow the international debt markets to understand that it may be on the table, that's important. Because not only are we internally looking at the budget, the international investment community is looking at the budget.
Looking at it, right?
All right, we have a lot of foreign debt in international hands. Recently we had a meeting about a month ago with a group of individuals representing companies that hold tens of millions of dollars of US dollar Bahamian debt. They came down here on a mission to get the feedback of the local banking sector, but also international banks. What was their feeling about the fiscal state of the country? Because they've got to make a decision. Do they retain their holdings? Do they reduce their holdings? Do they add to their holdings? So the international debt community is watching too.
As we were talking about inflation, we have many Bahamians who rely heavily on social services, right, for their daily needs. And we see this all the time. The budget promises increases in that assistance. We can only imagine, if brought to fruition, this could be a good thing. What say you?
In terms of how
it impacts the average
inflation
man on the
impacts?
street. Yeah.
Well, I think we're seeing that already.
Because I mean, with inflation, right? The fact is people are now having to perhaps rethink their spending. To David's point, you pointed out that you're going to the food store now. You're maybe not getting the nutritious meals that you would normally get. You're having to decide, am I going to spend that extra $20, $30 at the cash register, right? But with this budget promising these social services reliefs, can that really help?
I think the direct, if you take the reduction in VAT from 12 to 10, but expanding it to breadbasket items. I mean, I understand the rationale behind that as to why that may be a good thing. You'll get the arguments on the other side of the table as well as to why it's not a good thing. The intention being that for those most adversely affected who can least afford the tax on breadbasket items would get this direct support in the form of additional social services. I think that's the plan anyways. And I think that's perhaps where the budget is going with this. The challenge is, as I think what we're saying is, does the government, if this is an optimistic budget and things don't, and you don't need all three of the different events to go wrong, recession in the U.S., continued COVID, or a hurricane event. You just need one of these things, perhaps, one of these events to happen. Will the government be able to provide that social assistance? So that's the challenge. So with inflation, you've got the short-term effects, of course, which is what we're seeing now. But the midterm effect of an inflation rate that's 3 or 4% is that if salaries aren't moving up, which of course also further leads to further inflation, if the salaries aren't keeping up, then everybody's their financial well-being is just gradually being eroded as well. So there's the short-term and the medium-term effects of inflation. That's why, to David's point, all the central banks around the world are trying to keep that number down, but by closer to 2%.
Also want your thoughts on this. Energy, fuel continues to be a vexing discussion for many. Light bills skyrocketing, etc. People are still complaining about the cost of power. The government is proposing to seek a Caribbean partner in regards to fuel and also solar energy. Now, when former parliamentarian Leslie Miller was chairman of BPL, he proposed partnering with a Caribbean entity, and his idea was dashed, right? What makes basically the same idea better this time, you think?
I think I think the previous administration that's in power now had this idea of a rate reduction bond for BPL. The former administration followed up on it, and now I gather that that's fallen by the wayside. It's not happening. But tied into that rate reduction bond was putting BPL on a better financial footing, bringing in a Shell, or I think it was Shell was being discussed at the time, to run the plant and put in new engines, put in engines that were convertible to natural gas, so cleaner diesel, but also convertible to natural gas. That doesn't solve our problem overnight, but it does solve tremendously on a go-forward basis in 2 or 3 years once this infrastructure is in place, substantially reduces our costs, at least as the costs as they stood at the time this was planned. There's other instruments. I don't know where the hedging stands right now. My understanding was the hedging was either ending this June or perhaps it ran through 2024. My understanding of that hedging locked in the price of fuel at $60 for BPO, which with fuel right now at or gas prices, or sorry, oil at prices at 111, 114. Right. That's a tremendous savings to our economy. So I believe the government, as part of this, certainly in the energy, as far as energy goes, I think we need to be strongly looking at some sort of a PPP. Now, whether that's regional, whether that's an international player, whatever is going to work. As far as solar goes, I think we need to get the proper legislation in place here to help with that. Barbados has that legislation in place. We've actually done deals. We've done a green bond in Barbados for a company there because the regulations are straightforward. If you produce this is what you're going to get back, and it's it's a legal structure. It's a formal structure. Getting approvals are still tricky, as every place else.
For sure.
But it works. That process works there. So the Emera, who actually happens to be the generator in Barbados, is they've put that structure in place. So I think if we want to be serious about solar, it's like anything else in energy. You need a proper structure in place. And the legislative structure in place.
I want us to talk more about that, but we are going to take a break here and return with more on the record as we discuss the budget 2022-2023. Stay tuned. Definitely want to talk some more about that because
the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
at the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Welcome back to On the Record. Our topic for tonight is Budget 2022, a plan for recovery and progress. And our guests are Jim Wilson and David Slatter of RF Bank and Trust Limited. Gentlemen, let's get back to it. And in the break, we were talking about really the crux of this budget. And David, you had touched on some things that I thought were very important to continue to shape this discussion today.
Sure. I mean, if you look at the budget, you look at the breakout, I mean, 24% of it is for salaries and wages. So obviously government employees. Almost 19% is just interest expense. So this is the interest that the Bahamas has to pay to the holders of debt of the Bahamas. And almost 14% is for subsidies. Support to the PHA, support to other, maybe subsidies that help the other government, state-owned corporations, right? So that's 57% of the budget is in those three line items. That only leaves 44% of the budget for everything else. All the other line items, whether it's social assistance, all these other programs we're talking about. You know, as an investment manager with clients that hold, hundreds of millions of dollars of government debt, I was hoping to see something that would give myself and other members of the investment community a little more comfort that the fiscal affairs of the government are on more stable footing going forward. And all it is saying we think the economy is going to grow well, and therefore tax revenue will increase. That's all I see here. It doesn't give me the level of comfort I was hoping to see in the budget. I'm not sure about other investment managers, be they domestic or international. I can't speak for them. But all I can say is, you know, as long as the economy continues to grow as assumed, then it's fine. But if there's any reason to think that the economic growth assumed in the budget is not going to be achieved, then my comfort level with respect to putting new capital into government debt is weakened. And there's over $500 million in Bahamian dollar debt that has to be refinanced.
I was going to say, so you're already on edge, but then there's that $500 million debt that's also coming due, right?
This is just bonds that are maturing during the course of the balance of the year. Now, maybe that's in the budget somewhere. I don't see that broken out.
Yeah, we didn't see it broken out, so it's just a question mark that we have around it right now.
Well, a recent travel advisory has warned visitors that the Bahamas is a high crime zone. They should be very careful while here. The budget has allocated finances to assist the police with equipment to fight crime and the defense force to better protect our borders. Are we to expect crime-free communities, gentlemen, after the monies come into effect, or are there social ills here that just won't allow these monies to make a difference? What say you?
Let's have a little, just a thought exercise.
Sure.
What's the population of the Bahamas? 400,000 people?
You got 400, 350, 400,000. Yeah.
All right. How many people are in the police force and how many people are in the defense force? 5,000?
Yeah.
So,
And that's a collective number.
collective number.
Right.
So we have one member of the defense force, police force combined for every 80 Bahamians. We should be able to tackle crime. Why we can't, I'm not certain, all right? But we should be able to tackle crime. So more resources being dedicated to that effort is commendable, but they need to be used efficiently, and the general public needs to feel that the use of these the budget resources and the actions of those two institutions will lead to a reduction in crime and protection of our borders.
Well, from your vantage point, gentlemen, how does this really impact the way you do business?
It's so far, it's not been having a direct impact on us. It may have an impact on some of our staff, you know, on a day-to-day basis, for sure. In terms of, I mean, we're having an event tonight, credit card launch event, but one of the, I guess, the event's sponsors happens to be one of the big MasterCard in this case, sponsoring the event. He's had to cancel his trip to come down because we were raised to a level 3 level. So not a crime related, but it is a COVID related because his company doesn't allow them to travel to countries that are rated level 3 and above. So that's an impact that we have to be concerned about. As far as the crime goes, it has not impacted on tourism. So from our industry, I mean, our industry is everything because we're involved in my end on the investment banking side. I'm involved in financing different industries. So it has an impact on any one of my clients at any given time. So from the crime standpoint, for whatever reason, I think we've done a good job in letting, I guess, tourists realize that within their little enclaves that they come to visit here, they're not going to be at risk. And it's the only occasional time that it spills over. So I think from an economic standpoint, I don't think it's had an impact there. To your point, and I don't know I don't recall the budget numbers for education, but I think that's a big part of it in terms of, and I you know, Lord knows what's going to happen because of the last 2 years. I think with COVID and kids working remotely and a lot of kids not having access to the you know, laptops or tablets,
The technology.
the technology.
Yeah.
I think perhaps we may even fall further behind. I'm hoping that's not the case, but it's likely that's what's going to happen. That's going to impact industry here in terms of, as we move forward, in terms of having qualified staff to fill some of these fantastic opportunities that are coming up on the infrastructure side. right?
There's a lot to get to, right?
Yeah.
Look, you wanted to add to that, David?
Well, I was also, there's two things that are directly under our control that impact our quality of life, but also impact the tourism industry. Crime and pollution. Okay?
Sure.
We can control these things. I hope some of the budget that's increasing wages is also allocated towards ensuring that the environment that we have to live in and that our visitors have to experience is as clean and as pristine as possible.
And safe.
And safe.
Sure. And that's an issue that we've seen come up over and over again, time and time again.
Decade
right?
after decade after
Yeah.
decade, we have the same conversation.
And there's so much more to get to, but and so limited time.
Sure.
But small businesses is something that I really want to talk about, and we know that they'll be equipped to use the sand dollar, right? Are we, as a nation, ready for this digital asset?
I think we are and we're not. I mean, certainly the adoption of technology by the younger generations is certainly there. I mean, even myself, I downloaded it as soon as it came out. I have not used it, but I wanted to understand, the functionality of it to some extent. You don't really do that until you use it. So to that extent,
Sure.
I kind of stopped there.
Yeah.
Because when it first came out, there wasn't anything to use it on. I believe, especially in, with our how many ever really populous islands we have, say it's 15 or 20 islands we have, I think it's a fantastic way, especially with the large banks debanking in the family islands. And I think it's a fantastic way to move money around. And it's basically it's the Bahamian dollar you're moving around. And to pay people, to be paid, to pay your expenses, etc. So in terms of, is it going to be adopted? That really depends on the population and how willing they're to use the technology and how friendly the technology is. We've met with different groups who are looking to introduce different types of digital wallets and so on. So I think, it's a matter of picking the right one. I mean, there's, 5, 6 of these companies out there right now. I don't know how they're all faring, and maybe they're not all going to survive. But that's not necessarily a bad thing either.
Sure.
Because
Yeah.
if you can, if the fittest survive and you can get two or three strong entities, I mean, as we talked, we've only got a population of 350, 400,000 people. You can't have a multitude of these companies to be, being successful unless you're going to become a regional player. So I think the sand dollar has provided, I think we got written up as one of the first countries to have a digital currency.
Yes.
And I think we need to try and capitalize on that. And if we can, and export that technology now, that know-how to the rest of the region, at least to start, or a neighboring island, Turks, wherever it may be, I think it could give us, we keep talking about diversifying our economy away from tourism.
Sure.
We got to make sure the tourism
That conversation has been continuing for quite a while, right?
For a long time.
All right. I really want to get to more of that, but let's take another break here, and we'll be right back with more on the record right after this.
That was a quick 10 minutes, boy.
See, a lot of people confuse digital currency with cryptocurrency. Sand dollar. It's the Bahamian
So the project really pays itself back. They
Correct.
set up
At the conference,
the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Welcome back. Tonight we are discussing Budget 2022, a plan for recovery and progress, and our guests from RF Bank and Trust Limited are David Slaughter and Jim Wilson. Gentlemen, before the break, were talking about, or during the break, we were talking about digital assets, cryptocurrencies.
Right.
How is the government able to leverage something like cryptocurrency to help supplement its budgetary plan?
Well, we talked about the sand dollar being a digital currency, not a cryptocurrency. So it's effectively the Bahamian dollar, but it's about the technology that provides utility. As long as it's adapted adopted, by a sufficient segment of the economy, then there's utility in having the sand dollar on your phone, the ability to do transactions quickly and efficiently without the need to actually have cash on hand or go through the more traditional banking system as far as transfers and the like, or checks. So it should, in effect, we call it the multiplier effect, right? So the amount of times that a single dollar in the system is used to generate economic activity. So I think the wide adoption of the sand dollar could stimulate economic activity. Definitely, as Jim was saying, benefit the out islands. So for example, I'm a wholesaler or retailer in Long Island, right? And I need to order from my supplier. The mailboat's leaving. I got to catch it. Sand dollars to do the transaction versus how the heck, because the banking infrastructures are becoming weaker and weaker as banks debank from the out islands.
Sure.
So it should make life easier.
We've seen people having to use alternative methods.
Right.
Yeah.
So in addition to the multiplier effect that David's talking about, there's also practical savings, because the more people using electronic currency, the less actual dollars and $20 bills the government has to print. Right. So over time, there's a saving in that part that as well for the government, the central bank, the government, Treasury.
And we're also talking about the sand dollar. I think I stand to be correct, but I believe the Central Bank of the Bahamas was the first central bank on planet Earth to issue a digital currency. And as a result, Governor Roll was noted, I think, as one of the 50 most influential people. I'm trying to remember which magazine, but it was very impressive.
Yeah, I do remember seeing the international coverage of that.
Right.
Can't pinpoint right now
So
the exact organization. But
all of that positive PR about the Bahamas and what we're doing with cryptocurrencies, I can't say with certainty, but I'm sure the FTXs of the world got word of this and said, wow, okay, these guys are pretty progressive in this area. Why don't we consider moving there? And in the case of FTX, they've moved their global
now they're headquartered here. Yeah.
And other exchanges are looking at the Bahamas as well.
And how really does that, help really what is important for governments, right? Which is balancing the fiscal sheet. Yeah.
I don't know that it's helped the government balance the fiscal budget or anything like that, but
the idea that having the Bahamas seen as this potential hub where you can come and set up business,
that's
right?
Foreign direct investment.
Right.
That's job creation in a segment of not everybody wants to work in the hospitality industry, but you want to work in the financial industry.
It's that diversification, right?
It's more diversification within that industry, provided it all lasts, of course, and it's successful, and we're successful in implementing it all. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity for the country as we move forward. And I think, we've certainly taken the right steps. It's now how do we capitalize on that, to your point. And I don't have all the answers today in terms of how we do that, but I think by continuing to promote the country in that realm, in that area, I think there's already a second crypto exchange or whatever looking to move here, and there are probably more lined up behind them. Now, that'll come under fire as I understand California is looking to do something now in legislative, improving their legislation around it. So as the U.S. does that, of course, there are a lot more people there. But with technology today, why not the Bahamas?
Right. And government really recently published its white paper on cryptocurrencies, digital assets, and the Davis administration has said that it wants to become the leader in the region in the digital assets space.
Sure.
Does that help?
Well, absolutely. Well, let's look at FTX, for example, right? How many of their senior team have moved here? They had to buy homes, so they had to rent. They have to eat. They go to dinner. If they have children, they have to go to school. So all of these things feed into the revenue generation of the government, right? So revenue generation. So
they're participating in the economy.
Positive.
Right? Yeah.
And if you really want to go down, let's suppose 5 years down the road, these entities prove to have staying power and they're still here. If I'm going off to school today, and I'd like to be able to bring my intellectual capital back to the Bahamas, this is now a new area that I can bring my intellectual capital to. So maybe when I go abroad and I study finance, I make sure that I have a keen understanding of, say, the cryptocurrency market, because there may be a job opportunity back in the Bahamas with the FTXs of the world. So revenue enhancement, possible reduction in brain drain, which is, economies drive based on what? They drive based on innovation, productivity. All right, so, and then you need the capital, but if you're not innovative and you can't be productive, then people aren't going to give you that capital. So the more of our brain power we can retain in the Bahamas, the more productive and innovative we can be. So it's a positive.
Yeah.
It's a positive.
Right. And so,
net positive, yeah.
So we'll wait and see, right? Shortly after the delivery of the budget presentation in the House of Assembly, PLP Party Chairman Fred Mitchell, who is also the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he issued a statement congratulating the Prime Minister on the budget, saying it sets the pathway for the forward, progressive, and resilient growth of our country. Do you agree with Minister Mitchell?
I think insofar as there's no new taxes are always, we need to pay our bills. So government needs to implement taxes or maintain taxes, improve on tax collection. I think insofar as there's no new taxes burdening the commercial segment of the economy, the business segment of the economy, yeah, that would be a positive. But again, it's an optimistic budget because that's only going to work insofar as none of these other externalities impact us.
Yeah.
Right.
So what say you, David?
No new taxes this budget,
Right.
but we're still of the view that down the road, whether it's corporate tax, some kind of income tax is going to be needed. And we have currently, we have a very regressive tax structure. The poor are disproportionately taxed relative to their income versus the rich. So if we make the tax structure more progressive, fairer, and at the same time, we have confidence that the tax revenue is being used in a productive manner, there's no reason why individuals and corporations down the road wouldn't be more supportive of perhaps paying a tax. Granted, also on the global tax structure side, so this is idea of a 15% corporate tax minimum threshold. If we adopted that kind of tax down the road, that would perhaps give us more leverage in these discussions with the OECDs of the world and like say, hold on, guys, we have a corporate tax.
I think that tax is going to come into question with the U.S. midterm elections. I think we'll see some backpedaling on that if, as projected, the Republicans take over the Senate, retake the Senate. I do believe that for us here in the Bahamas, I think implementing a corporate tax, but a broader base. Let's tax the IBCs that are here, but not at 15%. Let's tax them at, is it 3% or 5%?
Right.
Broaden the tax base for those entities operating here.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll lose some,
Sure.
but Barbados has had a tax on their IBCs for any number of years now. I'm not sure how long it's been in place. What is important is that from the OECD countries, the EU and these countries, is that it's the same tax. It can't be seen to favor Bahamian entities over foreign entities or vice versa. So it has to be the same tax rate. So you introduce a 3% or 5%. I don't know. The accountants out there, I'm sure if I spoke to Gowan would have an opinion on this, right?
For sure.
But what does that tax look like?
Yeah.
And you broaden that base. There's got to be billions of dollars sitting here not being taxed in income. So.
Well, let me ask you this. The former Prime Minister, Hubert Minnis, on record in recent weeks saying that he believes government should tax the rich to feed the poor. And David, you were touched on something similar earlier. Do you agree with that statement?
It's a very populist kind of statement. Yeah. You've got a Canadian government that's trying to do that now. It's a very short-term strategy because capital is mobile, especially today. And the wealthy, you saw them flock to the Bahamas during COVID. They've bought up, I don't know that there's a lot of vacant, expensive homes or islands left that were available for sale. They will simply pick up and move someplace else if you overtax them. So what I'm proposing, I'm not proposing, I think other people have proposed it, I just think it's a fantastic idea, is at minimum corporate tax.
Yeah.
Nothing to scare people away, nothing too onerous to scare people away. But once you've got that in place, you can get the creep in there over time.
Yeah.
When you do need to tweak it, it's easier to tweak.
And you can set up
Right, so-
tax treaties with other countries, right?
Yeah.
So, you
And
know,
they also get credit.
and it motivates companies to move their headquarters here.
Yeah.
Sure. All right. And still talking tax in regards to VAT, right? The Prime Minister says the reduction his government signed off on when coming to office is overall good for the Bahamas. Do you agree, given that some food items became taxable in
I
that
think
move?
I think we touched on this a little while ago. Is that the bread basket items, the most impacted are the poorest and of our society, and the most impacted by these taxes. So insofar as the government can offset this through social programs, then it should be a net positive, because less tax is actually better for business to grow. Hopefully you increase the activity, as David mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and if you have just kind of a simpler tax structure, right, and you remove this constant cherry picking from administration to administration on the higher here, lower here, low here. 10% across the board. I know initially it's tough on the bread basket items, and I heard this morning, or was a recent discussion by Minister Alkitis, that there's certain, say, fast food franchises and other entities like that previously were paying zero on what were bread basket items, are now paying VAT on them. But I like simpler tax structures, easy to understand. It's deemed to be fairer. Now, down the road, a corporate tax or income tax, ensuring that the tax burden doesn't just fall disproportionately on
But yeah,
The least-
on the least,
the most vulnerable.
most vulnerable,
Right.
and the least able to afford the tax. So by
Right.
taxing at that level, yeah, I mean, these taxes are passed on, but it is more progressive in the sense that it is taxing on, like the business tax now, which is on revenue. You tax what is actually, on a profit.
Yeah, people don't realize that the businesses today that are paying premium tax or paying tax on their gross revenue of 2-3%, whether you're in the banking or insurance sector, if you take that and put it to the bottom line, it's effectively like a corporate tax of like 20 to 40%, depending on how good the year was. So companies are paying tax. It's just not called corporate tax.
I want to talk more about money, right? The numbers, the dollars and cents. The Prime Minister said monetary conditions in the Bahamas remain favorable and support stability in our exchange rate. He said that at the same time, the subdued level of private sector lending activity contributed to ongoing buoyancy and in liquidity levels and growth in external reserves. With the relaxation of COVID-19 restrictions, external sector developments featured a narrowing of the estimated current account deficit by 163.4 million, or 6.9%, to 2.2 million. Your thoughts?
You look
here,
at that
what-
number, I didn't.
Well, a lot of people confuse devaluation and default.
Right.
So devaluation means that we cannot maintain the peg of 1-to-1. All right, our foreign reserve position is what determines whether or not that can be the case. We see very little risk of devaluation. First of all, there's no economic incentive for it. It's not as if we are producing and exporting stuff, and therefore a weaker currency makes our goods more attractive, more competitive. We export service. And for example, tourism, as we know, every dollar we earn in tourism revenue, about 90 cents of that went to import what allowed us to earn the dollar. So we can't create a competitive advantage by devaluing. So we don't think devaluation is a risk. Default, on the other hand, is really what we're talking about here today. We're talking about the fiscal budget. We're talking about debt to GDP of over 100%. We're talking about over 18% of the budget going to pay interest on the debt. We're talking about principal coming due. So as an investment manager, my main concern is more about the need to restructure our debt or the risk of default. Still a risk that we have to consider and we need to manage.
Yeah, and there's so much more to talk about. And
Yeah.
I know we could continue on that trend, but gentlemen, we are going to take our final break here and come back with more on the record right after this. To discuss. There's so much to consider, so much to talk about.
To the
So the project really pays itself back. They
Correct.
set up
At the conference,
the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Welcome back to On the Record. Now, gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the show. And I want to talk the budget, from the budget to finance operations. Government net debt increased over the 9 months by $677.4 million, resulting in a total direct charge or direct claims on government at the end of March 2022 of just over $10.5 billion, or 87.5% of GDP. This represents a significant decline from the position at the end of June 2021 when government's debt was 101.0% of GDP. Progress? What do you think that figure should be by the end of the next fiscal year, given all the niceties that we see in this proposed budget?
Well, definitely progress. There's no doubt about it. Now, economists would say that you should be targeting around 50% debt to GDP as your cap.
Right.
And that's kind of the healthy limit. That was 7 years ago, 8 years ago.
Sure.
We were at that level. Since then, we've been steadily increasing. Now, the budget for next year is that we're at 87.5. This is totally dependent, as you said earlier. Will the economy continue to grow to allow the government to generate the revenue they're talking about, so that their deficit is reduced, so that the amount of the deficit is low as possible, and at the same time, that also determines the GDP number. So the assumption of economic growth reduces reduces the numerator and increases the denominator. Right? So increases GDP,
Right.
reduces overall debt, which creates a better result of 87.5. So it's all tied together.
Yeah.
Economic growth doesn't meet the targets, then the level of government debt is higher than expected, and the size of GDP is lower than expected. So you can in other words, it wouldn't take much to suddenly go from 87 back to 100 if things don't work out as projected.
And then this is where we begin to see that bordering on downgrade territory. Yeah?
Well, we're already at single B. I mean, we've been
Yeah.
downgraded, and the challenge is international, the fiscal stability of government going forward and the perception of that stability, right? And therefore, the investment community, be it domestic and/or international, the decisions that will be made.
All right.
The rates of return that will be expected. If
Yeah.
I'm going to take on this risk, right now you've got bonds of the government of the Bahamas on international markets trading at yields to maturity of 12, 13, 14%.
What does that mean to me sitting at home right now?
That means the
Fearing
international community means that,
That means our ability to borrow,
Right.
like it was at the beginning of the pandemic,
yeah,
has substantially reduced. To borrow at a reasonable rate, what you would expect a government to be able to borrow at. But if we were to go to market now in the U.S. Or abroad, we would be looking. The investors would be looking for a over 10% return. So on our bonds.
All right. Well, with that, based on current projections, we anticipate our revenue collections for the full fiscal year to total $2,455.1 million. That equates to $208.6 million above the revenue targets established in June 2021. On the expenditure front, current trends suggest total recurrent expenditure will settle at an estimated $273 million, and capital expenditure at $230.6 million.
right.
Is this wishful thinking?
Well, no, the fiscal year ends June 30th, so we're almost there. So, I mean, we think these numbers are probably pretty accurate. I would assume so, given that we probably have data up till the end of April, if not the end of March. So we're only talking about 1, 2, maybe 3 months of unknown as far as where these numbers will end up. So I think those numbers are realistic. And, it's a function of the recovery of the tourism sector. I mean, if you look at the number of arrivals and you look at the number of cruise passengers, It's been a nice, just steady improvement. We're not back to 2019 levels yet, but we're definitely, the trend is to be there next year. So that positive trend is feeding into the expectation of GDP growth, but there's risks that that trend is undermined. And that's what we talked about earlier.
Right, that's where we talk about.
So the numbers for the end of June, yes, we think these numbers are realistic. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is June 30th, 2023. Where are we? Are these projections for that date realistic?
Are we meeting the targets?
Yeah.
Right?
And
Yeah, are we able to
Yeah.
meet the
Are we
targets?
meeting the targets?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, we are expecting by mid-year budget to be able to determine how much on target we are.
We are,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And you can keep, you know, here's how you keep track of the local economy. You look at the tourism numbers, but if you know somebody in the shipping community, they're the ones who are they're the leading indicator, because they'll tell you shipping's up, shipping's down.
Right.
And you can automatically feed that into, okay, the hotels aren't ordering as much, therefore they're expecting less business. That's bad for the. So
And to the point, shipping dictates movement, which
That's
means
right.
things are moving, things are happening. So
It also dictates expectation. So if I'm ordering today to sell in the future.
Right.
If I'm optimistic about the future, my ordering today will be greater. If I'm more pessimistic, then I'm going to cut back. I don't want to hold inventory, have my cash wrapped up in inventory if I don't think I can sell it. So the shipping industry is really the leading indicator for the Bahamian economy.
And as of right now, I think Sandy Sands was on the record yesterday in the paper saying, you know, the summer is looking good for Baha Mar. So, and I suspect Atlantis is in the same place. So I think these, you know, that's all part of that. How are we looking? So in the short term, I think it all looks great. And if we, hopefully it can be maintained, and these numbers will even surpass these numbers in this, what I've termed the optimistic budget, right? I mean, that's our hope. We're all here. We all want the best for the country. So
yeah.
Yeah.
With this budget, do you think we can afford another lockdown?
I think it's been proven. You look at what's happened in China right now, that the lockdowns don't work. I think at the outset, where we were really concerned, I should caveat that, where we were really concerned about being overwhelmed at our medical facilities, I think it was the right move. I don't know any other way that we could have accomplished what we did. And it was a tough decision, but I think it was probably the right decision. Yeah. Where we've come, where we know more about transmission, we know about, you know, what's happening with this disease, and hopefully milder, although I've heard of, you know, I know people in my family here have gotten sick, right, with COVID just in the past week or so. So it's very much prevalent. We have clients that have had, you know, a number of cases within their companies and had to send people home again. I don't know that lockdowns are the solution, though.
Yeah.
I really don't think that's the solution.
And again, can we really afford it when we're depending on our growth in tourism in the sector that we are seeing happening now, right? Now that we're no longer in that phase, now that we've opened up more and more over time, and we're seeing the numbers in the tourism sector go up, right? Which, again, biggest source of revenue for the country.
Right, I think there's a number of things. Number one, we know more about the disease and how to manage it, as more and more people have either been vaccinated or had exposure to it. So, I mean, all, you know, vaccine is simply an intentional infection to protect oneself, so your body develops protection. Also, as the new variants have become less and less severe as far as the disease, they may be more contagious, but the disease is far, far milder. But as Jim mentioned, you know, our resources in our hospital sector are limited. There's only so many rooms. So I had a loved one last year that needed a procedure, nothing to do with COVID, guess what? And it was very urgent. No room at the inn for 2 days because the room was full of COVID patients. The ICU unit, full. So, you know, that's why things had to be done back when the disease was severe. Now that we understand that the disease is not as severe, and hopefully the potential risk to overwhelming our medical infrastructure is less, the need for lockdowns, I think, are tremendously reduced. And I don't think socially we're going to put up with lockdowns. I don't think the public is willing to say, oh, we're going to get locked down again. So
Final thoughts.
yeah.
Final thoughts, gentlemen.
You wanna go ahead, or?
I hope that a year from now, if we have this conversation, that the actual numbers are far better than the budget. So just to be straightforward, hey, we hope the economy
think we're all
grows.
hoping.
We
We're
hope
all
the
hoping
economy
that. We're all
grows
hoping that.
faster than is expected by the budget, and therefore, we're in an even better fiscal position. That said, it's prudent to set up scenarios that aren't the optimistic scenario.
Yeah.
There's risks that need to be managed.
And Jim?
I agree wholeheartedly. I think what I'd like to see more, and as we move forward, and perhaps this wasn't the time to do it, is what is government thinking about a corporate tax? What is government thinking about perhaps selling off some of these legacy businesses that government is in? I'm a believer in government providing framework and then getting out of the way of business to do the job. When you're starting an industry, sure. Are you starting in a new field? Then maybe government needs to be involved, especially when it comes to the social services side of things. But as much as government can get out of the way and let, what it is, the BPLs, the Bahamas years of this world, like why is government still in these businesses? Let private industry take it over.
I wish we could continue this conversation, but gentlemen, we are out of time. Thank you so much for your expert input on the proposed budget. We hope to see you back here with us on the record soon. Yeah?
Thank you very much for having us.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So now our discussion topic tonight was Budget 2022, a plan for recovery and progress. And our guests from RF Bank and Trust were David Slatter, VP of Investments, and Jim Wilson, VP of Corporate Finance. Join us again next week with another topic that directly affects the lives of Bahamians. And until then, I'm Convino Knowles.